Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on Indian philosophy, today once again we are going to talk on Nyaya Philosophy. We have conducted 3 sessions on Nyaya Philosophy, and these are the introductory lectures on Nyaya Philosophy. This is the 4th part where we are going to understand more about Nyaya Philosophy. Friends, for discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Verma's immense experience always helps us in understanding different topics of philosophy in detail. So friends, we believe that today also we are going to get in-depth knowledge on today's topic. If you have any queries regarding the lecture, and if you feel so that after listening to the lecture you have questions, so at the last 10 minutes of the lecture you can ask questions. You can contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Ajay Verma, once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Welcome viewers. So as you're already aware, in this series we are having discussions on Nyaya Philosophy, and so far we have discussed the metaphysics. We already know that they borrow a large amount of their metaphysical presumptions, the main tenets of their philosophy from Vaisheshika philosophy. And more or less, Nyaya Philosophy system is are considered two allied schools of Indian philosophy. So far we have discussed different categories as enumerated by the founder of Nyaya Philosophy, namely Gautama. And we have had a brief discussion on each one of those categories. And in our last lecture, we had just about begun our discussion on the nature of self according to Nyaya Philosophy. And so today, the agenda for this lecture would be that we would have a brief discussion on the nature of self according to Nyaya Philosophy, and after that we would have a brief discussion on what their idea of liberation is, and we'll follow that by discussion on one of the main pramanas that they adhere to, namely perception. So, with this agenda in mind, let's begin our discussion on the nature of self. So, the Nyaya Visheshika system believes in a permanent self and makes cognition, that is jnana, awareness or consciousness, which it describes as the basis of all life's activity, one of its possible attributes. In addition to this, 5 other specific attributes which the self may contingently have are of psychological nature. These are attachment, rag, aversion, dvesh, pleasure, sukha, pain, dukha, and volition or yatna. Of these 6 attributes, jnana and yatna correspond to cognition and conation, and the remaining 4 may be viewed as roughly representing what would now be described as the affective side of the mind. So, and this is, I'm quoting from the famous work by M. Hiriyanna, namely Outlines of Indian Philosophy. So, as we are sort of already aware, according to Nyaya Philosophy, self is essentially without any properties, so to speak. So, all properties that it may have arise only adventitiously, but in its original pristine form, its essential nature is that of being without any properties. And Nyaya Philosophy, as we discussed briefly in our earlier lecture, according to Nyaya Philosophy, jnana or cognition or awareness or consciousness is also one of the properties of the self. And apart from awareness or consciousness, there are other kind of psychological, sort of attributes that it may have, which basically are sort of dependent, on the awareness. So then these five are rag, dvesh, sukha, dukha, and yatna. And of course, of these six attributes, jnana and yatna correspond to cognition and cognition, and are more important from the point of view of the overall metaphysics that Nyaya philosophy propounds, because according to them, first we come to have an awareness of an object, and that awareness, if it is prama, then it reveals its object in its true structure, and depending upon that cognition, that true cognition or prama, some kind of response is elicited from us, which is referred to by the term yatna. So of these six attributes that according to Nyaya Visheshika philosophy self may have, jnana and yatna correspond to cognition and cognition, and they are of a slightly different nature, and the four others, namely rag, dvesh, sukha and dukha, may be viewed as roughly representing what would now be described as the affective side of the mind, as Harina points out. Now, the three attributes of cognition, that is feeling and volition, are in any specific case supposed to manifest themselves in the self in a particular order. First knowledge, then desire, and last volition. So as pointed out just now, there is a specific order that one could see. First of all, we have awareness of an object, which is followed by some kind of a psychological response. It may create some kind of aversion in us. We may like the object, we may not like it, which would create the feeling of aversion in us. And depending on that, lastly, would be our volition. So if we like the object, we may be prompted to do something, to perform an action in order to possess that object. Or if the psychological response that is aroused is something else, then there would be a corresponding volition in that case. So now we also have to know a thing before we can feel the want of it, and it is to satisfy that want that we will to act. Feeling thus mediates between cognition and cognition. So, as pointed out, first there is cognition, and then there is some kind of a psychological response to that, and depending upon that, we act towards the object. So our actions towards the objects are conditioned by the feelings, which are in turn depend upon the cognition of the object. Nayayikas make a distinction between presentative cognition, which is called anubhava, and representative cognition, known as smriti. The former generally leaves behind a trace or impression called bhavana or sanskar, which abides in the self, and when revived leads to recollection of what was previously cognized. That is smriti or memory. Such bhavana is a seventh specific quality of the self. So now, this distinction is also important from the point of view of epistemology as propounded by Nyaya philosophy. So Nayayikas make this distinction, very important distinction, between presentative cognition, that is anubhava, and representative cognition, that is smriti. So according to Nyaya philosophy, any cognition, in order to qualify as prama, has to be presentative in character, has to be of the nature of anubhava. So it should be presentative in character, in the sense that the object corresponding to that particular cognition should be out there. Whereas smriti is a representative cognition, which means that something we saw some time back, there is a picture of that thing in our mind, which is revived in the representative cognition, as opposed to the presentative cognition, where this mediation, this double kind of a mediation, is not there. So in presentative cognition, we have some kind of direct awareness of the object, which is more of an idea held by naive realists, and we will be discussing shortly about what could be the different kind of realism, and since there is a strong reason for us to believe that Nyayikas should count as naive realists, so therefore they believe that any cognition to count as knowledge or prama should be presentative in character. Its object should be out there, available in cognition to us, whereas in representative cognition, the object, the cognition is representative of something that was cognized at some time. So this is the main difference between the presentative cognition and representative cognition, and since Smriti, is sort of cognitions generally leave behind traces of impressions called bhavana or sanskara. That is considered, as another, quality that self may have. The important thing to notice here, that self may adventitiously have. So otherwise, as pointed out earlier, self is without any properties in its original pristine nature. So now the relationship between self and consciousness. Consciousness and knowledge are adventitious qualities of the self, as pointed out. Consciousness is not an essential quality of the self, is proved by occurrences of deep sleep, where there we do not have any consciousness about anything, we don't have any awareness about anything, and also similarly in the states of swoon or states of lack of consciousness. So, since we could have self without consciousness, like in deep sleep or in swoon, in the state of swoon, therefore it shows that self could be without any properties. So, in its original form, self could be without any awareness. Consciousness arises when self or soul comes in contact with the mind, and mind comes in the contact with the senses. This is something that we have discussed earlier as well. Self, though eternal, is itself unconscious like material things, but unlike them, it may have consciousness contingently, depending upon other conditions. So self, though initially material, almost like Sankhya's believe it to be, but unlike material things which are incapable of having any awareness at all, even contingently or even adventitiously, self, may at least contingently have this quality of consciousness. So in that respect, we cannot say that self is completely material in nature, which is a view which is held by the materialist school of thought in Indian philosophy, namely Charvakas. So here we see that since self could be without consciousness, which is something that is also held by Charvakas, but we should not confuse Nyaya view of the self with Charvakas view of the self, because Nyayikas are not, they are realists, but they are not materialists, and there is a difference between the two. So self, according to them, is it may be unconscious, but they do not have the materialist view of the self. And what differentiates it is that material may not have consciousness, whereas self has that capacity. Now, coming on to Nyaya notion of liberation or upvarga, Nyayikas have a very unique view of liberation that they call upvarga. They conceptualize it as a state of soul characterized by lack of association of soul with anything else. So this is a state where soul is completely aloof from anything else. It ceases its association. It ceases to have any association with anything else. So it ceases to have any association with the manas, which connects it to the world outside. So all the association with any outside world, or for that matter any feelings, because also we know that manas is the sixth internal sense organ, and it collects what is called the internal states, like pain and pleasure. So therefore the soul in its state of liberation cuts off its connection with manas, and therefore its connection with the outside world is completely lost. Its connection also with some of the internal mental states is also lost. So liberation is conceptualized by Nyayikas, as a state of soul, as detached from the body and mind, where it becomes devoid of any qualitative subjections and stays all by itself in its true nature, in its original true nature. Once all the ties of the soul are severed, it is set aloof from all pain or pleasure, which is considered to be the state of liberation by the Nyayikas. So we must notice here also that Nyayikas do not think of liberation as some kind of a state of happiness or pleasure. Rather, liberation or apavarga is considered to be a state of the soul which is without any quality. So it is a state which is beyond either pain or pleasure. So there are no qualities, no properties that a soul has in this particular state. So we can't really say, we don't really have much a reason or warrant to say that liberation is a state of pleasure or happiness. As opposed to that, Nyayikas would rather think of it as a state of soul where soul doesn't have any properties, where it severs all its connections with the outside world, where it severs all its connections even with the different feelings that arise within the body. So this is how Nyayikas think of liberation as a peculiar, as a very unique state of the soul. Now, having discussed, very briefly, of course, the Nyaya conception of the self and Nyaya conception of liberation that they name as apavarga, now we could move on to a discussion on different pramanas that Nyayikas adhere to. As we have discussed earlier, since pramana is also one of the categories that is enumerated in Nyaya Sutra. So Nyayikas believe in four different pramanas, and they are perception, inference, similarity or comparison, known as upamana, and lastly shabda or verbal testimony. So now, so the next in our agenda would be to have a discussion on each one of these pramanas one by one, and we could begin our discussion on different pramanas as adhered to by Nyayikas, beginning with the very first pramana, which is perception. But before we begin our discussion on perception, as a matter of fact, the kind of definition the Nyayikas offer for perception, would make more sense to us if we understand what kind of view of the world they hold. as we discussed right in the beginning of our first lecture. So therein it was pointed out that that Nyayikas are a system of realism and pluralism, which very broadly means that they believe that the world outside of us is real, which means that it has an entity of its own apart from the knowledge of it. So even if there is nobody having a cognition of something, even then that object has a reality of its own. It exists out there in the world in its own right. So this is broadly what realism means, but there could be different kind of realisms as well. So first of all, we should try and look at the definition of realism. So realism at its simplest and most general is the view that entities of a certain type have an objective reality, a reality that is completely ontologically independent of our conceptual schemes, linguistic practices, beliefs, etc. Thus, entities including abstract concepts and universals as well as more concrete objects have an existence independent of the act of perception and independent of their names. So realism is basically an idea, as pointed out, which propounds that things have an objective reality. They are ontologically independent of what we think of them, how we think of them, or whether we think of them at all. Whatever practices, linguistic practices, whatever name we may have for those things, things remain unaffected. Things are out there in the world independently of such linguistic practices or the beliefs thereof. So and also apart from that, things have an existence independent of the act of perception and independent of their names. Now, realism is, could also be better understood as contrasted with anti-realism. Anti-realism would be any position which denies the objective reality of entities, and with nominalism, which is a position, which basically a position which means that abstract concepts, general terms, or universals have no independent existence but exist only as names. And with idealism, which is a position that the mind is all that exists and that the external world is an illusion created by the mind. So, as opposed to realism, which believes that things have, an independent reality, an entity of their own, independent of anything else, anti-realist position, could be several, including nominalism and idealism. So, nominalism holds that that abstract concepts, general terms, or universals have no independent existence but exist only as names. So, from this point of view, if you look at Nyaya Philosophy, they are not nominalists at all, because for them, things have a nature of their own, and they have a nature of their own in virtue of a universal called Samanya that inheres in those things. So, a chair is cognized as chair, is known as chair, because there is a universal, namely chairness, that resides, that inheres in any particular chair, because of which it is cognized as a chair. So therefore, Nyayikas are realists, and they are in the same token, they are anti-nominalists, which means that according to them, general terms have a meaning for a reason. So chair, that certain objects are called chairs. Chairs are called chairs because of a specific reason. It's not just a mere name. Basically, nominalism means that words are mere names and they do not have any correspondence with the object they name. So they are like just any chosen arbitrary tokens, which do not have anything to do with the real nature of the object. So in that sense, Naiyayikas assume an anti-nominalist position, a realist position, that is. And also another anti-realist position would be idealism, which is a position that mind is all that exists and that the external world is an illusion created by the mind. And sort of very often most of the arguments that are given in favor of idealism would already be known to you by this time. So idealism is basically a sort of the argument that is offered generally in the favor of idealism is that we do not have any direct access to anything that exists outside of our mind. So only access that we have at all to our impressions and ideas, as pointed by Hume in Western philosophy. So we only are aware at any moment of our impressions and ideas. And whether there is a source of these impressions and ideas is something that we can never verify, because an object is the only way an object becomes known to us is only through ideas. So our world is completely a world created. It's a construct of ideas, and beyond that, if there is anything else, we could never know with certainty, because ideas are all that we have any direct access to. And beyond that, any sort of anything that we posit is a matter of postulation, is a matter of inference, and inference is not a direct source of knowledge and could often be wrong. Therefore, according to idealism, we do not have any warrant to believe that there could be things outside of our mind existing independently of our knowing of them. So this way, this is what So we had a look here at what generally we mean by realism, and how realism is contrasted with certain anti-realist position, mainly among them nominalism and idealism. Now, in turn, realism could also be of several kinds, but we would look at mainly two kinds of them. So to begin with, there is something called representative realism. And according to representative realism, our perceptions are not direct, and that objects do not exist as we see them, but that we perceive the world through the medium of sense data. So representative realism argues that our perceptions are not direct, and that objects do not exist as we see them, but that we perceive the world through the medium of our sense data. Following this view, it is not possible to know the object as it exists, but only the qualities that are transmitted to us via sense data. So as a matter of fact, some of the earlier known forms of realism were of the kind of representative realism. As a matter of fact, when we look at modern Indian philosophy, modern Western philosophy, after Enlightenment, there was this one major view that all objects out there in the world, do have an independent existence. So they had a realist point of view, in that sense. But at the same time, these philosophers, believed that these objects are all the time sending out some kind of sense data towards us, towards our senses. As a matter of fact, some of these philosophers even believed that this sense data is of the nature of some kind of corpuscles, And these corpuscles, as a matter of fact, according to them, have some kind of sort of a direct collision or direct interaction with our sense organs. Say, for example, eyes, and then our sense organs are incited, and this is how, and in turn, which in turn incites our mind, where the perception of things takes place. So this idea, broadly speaking, is what sort of amounts to a representative realism, which is the idea that things, objects out there in the world do have an independent existence, but what we have direct access to is a picture that is created in our mind through the sense data that we receive, that is all the time being sent out to us from these objects, and that sense data. So there is some kind of a mediation that is involved here between the thing out there and our perception of it. So the sense data is representative of the thing out there, and the sense data is all that we have access to. So it is some kind of sort of intermediary position between idealism and realism proper, but it is counted as realism because nonetheless sort of representative realism argues that objects are out there, but they may not be of the same kind, of the same nature as we perceive of them, because there is certainly some kind of a mediation involved. Say, for example, if we are sort of wearing some green glasses, it would appear as green to us. So friends, we'll continue our discussion on Nyaya Philosophy, and we'll be talking more about their idea of perception when we return after a short break. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Nyaya Philosophy. Friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Introduction to Nyaya Philosophy. This is the fourth lecture in the series, I would say, on Nyaya Philosophy, and so far we have discussed a lot. There is a lot more remaining for you. So in this session also we are going to give you in-depth knowledge. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is an associate professor and he is teaching in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Verma on today's topic, then do call us to our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Verma, once again. Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Kritika. So welcome back, viewers. So we were discussing, we were having discussion on different type of realism, and we were sort of looking at different kind of realism, mainly in the context of Nyaya Philosophy, because we want to sort of understand what kind of realist worldview Nyayikas propound. And once we understand that, it'll become easier for us to appreciate, the definition of perception that they offer. So, as pointed out, realism could be also of several kinds, but mainly it's considered to be of two types, namely representative realism and representative realism and naive realism. So we have already seen what representative realism means. Now, naive realism is the view, naive realism holds that the view of the world that we derive from our senses is to be taken at face value. There are objects out there in the world, and those objects have the properties that they appear to us to have. If I have an experience of a large apple tree, then that is because there is a large apple tree in front of me. If the apples on the tree appear to me to be red, then that is because there are objects in front of me, apples that have the property redness. Simple. So, basically, naive realism is, is a view which views the world as directly presented to us, as directly available to us in our cognition. So we don't believe here, unlike in representative realism, we don't think that what we see, what we think of an object is something of a separate realm apart from the object that exists out there. So we don't kind of bifurcate the world into two realms, where we think of on the one hand the realm of the outside world, of the objects which are constantly sending out sense data to us, and then there is this separate realm of sort of what we make of that sense data within ourselves, how we sort of put it together and create an image out of that which is representative of the object out there. So, unlike this kind of a view, which is named as representative realism, naive realism holds that the world is directly available to us for cognition, and there is no need to, so strictly speaking, to think of these two separate realms. So, so according to naive realism, things are, as they are revealed to us. So there is no sort of there is no, so to speak, intervention in between. So things, present themselves as they actually are. They present themselves as they actually are to us, and they are they are revealed to us. They are presented to us in their true nature, and they are grasped by our sense organs as they actually are. So there is, so to speak, a kind of a direct correspondence with the object that is available to us, in our perception, according to naive realism. So this is how we could understand different type of realism, and now if we look at these definitions, you would find that we have enough reason, we have enough warrant to believe that Nyayikas do not adhere to what is known as representative realism. They would rather they actually hold on to the view of naive realism, that is, that the world is directly available to us in our cognition. So and they sort of not only, like, they take it even further from there, as we earlier saw. They are also anti-nominalist, because according to them, they take their realism even to the extent of language. So we have we have like the structure of language is also such that it reflects the structure of the world as it is. So there is there is this there is some kind of a congruence, there is some kind of a correspondence between the object as it is presented to us, the object as it is known by us, and the object as it is expressed by us or as it is apprehended by us linguistically. So knowing an object, having the name for an object, having an expression for an object, and the actual existence of the object. These are, so to speak, three things which are in correspondence with each other. So the object as it is reflected in our cognition of it and our knowledge of it, and the object as it is reflected also in language, and whatever internal sort of unity of whatever schematic unity it may have, whatever kind of relationship it may bear with other objects in the world. So in that entire schema, so to speak, which is called as Naam Jati Adi Yojana. So all this kind of schematic sort of unity is reflected, the schematic unity that exists within the object, and it's this structural unity with other objects that is reflected in our knowledge of the world, and in turn is also reflected in the language, because we apprehend things through language. So that structure remains the same. So that way, Nyayikas, one could say, take Nyaya Realism to to another level. Now, according to Nyaya Philosophy as well, cognition, awareness of an object, could be of two types. It could be presentative or representative. Presentative cognition could be divided into immediate, that is pratyaksha, and mediate or paroksha. On the primary character of pratyaksha, is based its definition as knowledge which does not presuppose any other knowledge. So pratyaksha is a knowledge which is which results from results from a direct cognition of the object, which results from a direct connection of our sense organs with the object. So pratyaksha is considered, is mainly defined as knowledge which is immediate in character and not mediate. It is not mediated by anything. As a matter of fact, there is a little bit of difference of opinion about the definition of pratyaksha among the old Nyayikas and new Nyayikas. So new Nyayikas or Nyaya Philosophy, Navya Nyaya Philosophy holds that, and the propounder of that is Gangesha. So Gangesha was of the view that the Prachin Nyaya definition of perception is a little bit is wide in certain aspects and is also narrow in certain other aspects. So their focus was more on giving a definition of pratyaksha in terms of immediacy or mediacy. So from that point of view, we could think of pratyaksha as an immediate knowledge. So this is one aspect of pratyaksha. This one quality of pratyaksha, as propounded by some of the Nyayikas. So now it is further proved by certain examples. When we infer that there is fire on the hill, we should previously have observed smoke there. Not to mention our acquaintance with the inductive relation between smoke and fire, but to cognize blueness say no such preliminary knowledge is necessary. That is, our first ideas are furnished by the senses. There is another definition which is more useful in understanding the psychology of the perception. It states that it is knowledge which arises by contact of a sense organ with an object. Such contact is not the sole condition of perception, but it is distinctive feature. So, as pointed out earlier, Pratyaksha is defined. The first characteristic of Pratyaksha, which is more emphasized upon the later Nyayikas, is that of its immediacy. So, say for example, we immediately cognize an object as blue or red or whatever color it may have. Whereas all the other kinds of knowledge, say for example something that is a result of inference, or say for that matter something that is a result of a shabda, there is all these pramanas are mediated by some other kind of knowledge. So say for example for knowledge through shabda, first the shabdas have to be cognized either through vision if it's a written word, or through the perception through our ears if it's a spoken word. Whereas in inference, the object of knowledge is something removed from our sensory field, and it is it is known on the basis of sort of its known association with something else. So this is mediated. This kind of knowledge is mediated by something else. Whereas another kind of sort of knowledge, say for example cognition of blueness of say for example the waters in the sea, and that is something that is we become immediately aware of. So, and alternatively, sort of, another very distinct, feature of perception is that of sense organ contact. So, when our sense organs are in direct touch with a thing, then the cognition that results from there is called perception. So now, having sort of had a very general kind of an idea about what we generally understand by perception, now let's look at the definition of perception that is offered by Gautama, by Gautama in his Nyaya Sutra in 1.1.4. where he defines perceptual cognition as follows. So the definition of perception given there is indriyartha sannikarsha utpannam jnanam avyapadeshyam avyabhichari vyavasayatmakam pratyaksham, which could be roughly translated as perceptual cognition arises by means of the connection between sense faculty and the knowledge, that is indriyartha sannikarsha utpannam. So perceptual cognition arises by means of the connection between sense faculty and the object, indriya and earth. So from the sandhi of both is the very first term that arises is indriyartha. So indriyartha sannikarsha meaning having a concourse. So perceptual knowledge is something that results from the sannikarsha, concourse between indriya, between the senses, and the artha, and the object. And this is the distinctive feature, but not but not the only feature. So apart from this distinctive feature, other qualities that perceptual sort of awareness has is that it is not dependent on words, avyapadeshyam. So it is non-verbal in character, which refers to its immediacy. And also it is non-deviating. Non-deviating means it represents, it shows its objects its object in its true nature. So this is referred to by the term avyabhichari. It's non-deviating. perception shows its objects in its true nature. It shows its object. It makes the object available, to our knowledge in its true nature. So, in that sense, it's non-deviating. It's avyabhichari. And last condition is that it is determinate. It's vyavasayatmakam. It's determinate in character. Also, vyavasayatmakam would mean it's something that is expressible. It is something that could be, that should be communicable. It is, it is something that we could communicate to other, that we could express. It should be therefore of a determinate nature. So here we see that there are four distinctive, conditions that are given in the definition of perception as given by Gautama in his Nyaya Sutra. So, which is that perceptual knowledge is something that arises out of indriyartha sannikarsha. Meaning concourse between indriya and earth, concourse between sense faculty and the object. Another condition is that it is not dependent on words. Third which is avyapadeshyam. Third condition is that it is non-deviating. It is avyabhichari, and the fourth condition is that it is vyavasayatmakam, meaning it is determinate in character. Now, it might seem that this definition looks kind of contradictory because, on the one hand, it states that, the perceptual knowledge is not dependent on words. It is avyapadeshyam, meaning which would be tantamount to saying that in perceptual knowledge, all we have before us is sense data and sense data which is not yet conceptualized. So therefore, it is what is being referred to as perception is simply in terms of pure sense data. But that would make it absolutely similar to how Buddhists look at it. But on the one hand, Nayayikas, it seems through their definition, seem to define perceptual knowledge as independent of words. But at the same time, the last condition that is offered is that it should be vyavasayatmakam. It should be determinate in character, which means that it should be of the nature of judgment. It should be, we should have some kind of a definite view of the object resulting from its perception. So perception not only yields to us a simple, set of sense data emanating from the object, but in order for it to be determinate, it must be subject. It has to be subject to some kind of a conceptual scheme. So it has to be molded in a particular way through some conceptual scheme whereby we think of it as this object or that. So, in order to have any kind of thatness at all, any kind of whatness at all, it must be determinate in character. So, on the face of it, it might seem to us that this definition is flawed with some kind of a contradiction. Especially in terms of perceptual knowledge being defined in terms of something that is not dependent on words, and at the same time it's supposed to be determinate in character. So we'll come to that point later, but for the purpose of this lecture, what we can do is we can look at these four conditions, that is indriyartha sannikarsha, avyapadeshyam, avyabhichari, and vyavasayatmakam. These are the four conditions that are laid out in the definition of pratyaksha according to Nyaya Sutra, and we may try to look at these four conditions one by one. So let's begin our discussion with the first condition, that is Indriyarth Sannikarsha. So the actual process is generally described as follows. The self comes into contact with the manas with the senses, and the senses with the object. When, if certain external conditions like the presence of sufficient light are satisfied, perception takes place. It is obvious that the description applies only to cases involving voluntary attention, and the process is reversed when, for instance, a man waking from sleep perceives the things about him casually. So basically, it goes much deeper than that. It's not a mere sense-object contact. If we try to understand the entire structure, that is followed after, and after which the result is some kind of perceptual awareness. So what happens is our sense, organs come into contact with the object out there, and then, as pointed out earlier also, these sense data collected is given to manas. Manas in turn takes it to the self, and this is how the awareness arises. But this for awareness to arise, the perceptual awareness to arise, we must our manas, or our voluntary attention, must be focused on the object in question. So if that is not happening,
so we have a caller right now, so we should take the caller first. Hello. Hello, yes, please tell your name and ask a question.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Pawan.
Yes, Pawan, please ask a question.
Yes, ma'am. I want to know about the essence of Nyaya and Vaisheshika philosophy.
You want to know?
Essence of Nyaya and Vaisheshika philosophy.
Nyaya and Vishishtika.
I want to know about the essence of Nyaya and Vaisheshika philosophy.
What of
Yes,
Nyaya and Visheshika philosophy?
Nyaya and Vishishtika philosophy is asking about.
As pointed out earlier, Nyaya sort of borrows many of its metaphysical tenets from Vaisheshik philosophy. Vaisheshikas, were a different school, which, the Vaisheshika school, and the founder of that is, Kanad, and Vaisheshika sutras, are different, it's a different text altogether, but they are looked at as allied schools. And just like, as you must already be aware, Sankhya Yoga is taken collectively. They are thought of as, allied schools. Similarly, Nyaya Visheshik and among Mimamsakas, early Mimamsakas and Uttar Mimamsakas. So these, there are 6 orthodox schools altogether, and generally, 2 of them, they are thought of, in pairs, and each of these 2 schools are taken as allied schools. So we would have a detailed discussion on Vaisheshika philosophy, after we are done with Nyaya philosophy. So there'll be a topic of separate lecture for us. So, but for our present purposes, what you can understand is that as pointed out in the very first lecture on Nyaya philosophy, so it was pointed out there that initially, this set of philosophers who later came to be known as Nyayikas were earlier known as merely Tarkikas. So there were, a set of philosophers who taught others the art of argumentation. So, and art of argumentation, it was something that anybody could learn. So it could be, somebody who actually believes in Sankhya philosophy, but, maybe interested in the art of argumentation. So the school basically started, as Tark Shastra, where different kind of there was discussion on different kind of arguments, and what counts as good argument, what counts as bad argument, and so on and so forth. But eventually, they developed into a independent school of philosophy altogether at a later period, and the founder of this school is Gautama. and the foundational text of this school is Nyaya Sutras. And we have already earlier discussed the categories, padarthas as propounded by Gautama in his Nyaya Sutras. The categories propounded in Vaisheshika Sutras, there's a little bit of sort of very subtle differences between the two, which would be a topic of discussion of a separate lecture when we start discussing Vaisheshikas. When Nyaya school developed itself as an independent school, it borrowed mainly this metaphysical tenets from Vaisheshikas, because Vaisheshikas were also realists, of the kind of Nyayikas. And though, of course, their Praman Shastra is a little bit of there's a little bit of difference between their Praman Shastra. They don't believe in the same sort of set of pramanas as Nyaya Sutra, as Gautama does. So there are very subtle differences between the two. But when they sort of they presented themselves as an independent school, they borrowed a lot of their metaphysics from the Vaisheshika school. And this is the reason why Nyaya Visheshik, Nyaya school and Visheshik school are looked at as allied schools and are generally studied together. So I hope it gives some answer to your question. So we'll continue our discussion on Nyaya philosophy, on Nyaya theory of perception. So this is all we have time for today. We'll continue our discussion in the next lecture.
Definitely we'll continue the lecture in our forthcoming sessions. Friends, you are thankful. We are thankful to you for calling us, as well as continuously you are in touch with us. Today we are taking your leave with a promise that we are going to meet again very soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.